Distressed, faded, destroyed, and even soiled clothes are a genre of fashion that always seems to have consumers of every level of fashion XP in a chokehold, regardless of trend cycles. This seemingly counterintuitive style has had both mainstream and more niche fashion enjoyers taking turns putting these decrepit fits on. Although people often develop sentimental attachments to clothing items such as gifts or hand-me-downs, which due to their irreplaceable nature can become distressed and faded over time. However, this type of distressing is a byproduct of sentimentality rather than being the main aesthetic purpose. This video will focus more on cases like certain fashion MFs who will wear the most atrocious vintage graphic t-shirt purely because it has some fading and single stitching on the arms. You know, the type of individuals who would look at this ancient hoodie and tell you that it has a safety pin closure feature instead of the zip being broken. I'm all for getting as much wear out of your clothes, but bro, let this poor hoodie's soul finally rest. The equivalent of eternal damnation for clothes must be getting put in the hands of true vintage collectors or resellers. As already mentioned, distressed clothes are by no means something exclusive to niche fashion communities. Ripped jeans were probably one of the most mainstream and popular clothing items of the 2000s and 2010s, and by today's standards, would probably be described as NPC fashion by people who spend too much time on TikTok. The current fashion zeitgeist is still very much in an affair with distressed clothes, especially with the rise of jeans with artificial fading, washes, and other forms of distressing. There are definitely people watching this video who would immediately buy the Acne Studios poo-poo smear jeans if an extra £600 magically appeared in their bank account.
How much do these jeans cost?
£100.
6 bomber ass clad, pussy bomber blood clad. £100.
There are two main categories of distressed clothes: authentic distressing, which comes from years of wear and tear, and then there's artificial distressing, which is done during the garment's production. People at all corners of fashion culture seem to be obsessed with fucked up clothes, so I thought it'd be interesting to delve into these two categories of distressing plus a third kind of bonus one, and then look into the social and cultural implications of people choosing to present themselves in old fucked up clothes or ones that were made to emulate old and fucked up clothes. There is no definitive origin of distressed clothes, but punk and the subsequent grunge scene that emerged towards the end of the 20th century are widely considered to be when distressed clothes were really first popularized and presented as cool. The late 70s and 80s punk scene saw the rise in people styling distressed, deconstructed, and DIY fashion as a form of nonconformity and rebellion. And then the grunge scene was essentially the 90s version of this, with an emphasis on secondhand, very worn and kind of grotty looking clothes. That's a very brief summary, but I've already made a 46-minute long video about punk fashion that also touches on grunge, so I'll resist the YouTuber's urge to pad out a video with subjects they've already covered. If we're talking about artificial distressing, then ripped jeans are naturally the best place to start. They are very likely the most popular and widely accepted form of distressed clothes. In the early 20th century, wearing ripped denim jeans meant you were likely an impoverished worker who would tear up their jeans doing manual labor. In the 21st century, ripped jeans are still usually torn up by impoverished workers, but only now it's done in a sweatshop and then sent to Western countries where consumers can blissfully enjoy their super cheap, pre-distressed jeans. In the 2010s, ripped jeans really felt like the MVP item for fast fashion brands. However, I assume if you watch this channel regularly, then you'd probably prefer it if I talk about something slightly more artistic or niche than breaking down the stereotypical basic white girl uniform from a decade ago. So, let's start with a fashion fan favorite, Kapital. If you don't know the brand, which is unlikely, they are generally considered to be one of the best Japanese fashion labels. Do you know how hard of a reputation that is to achieve? Japan is known for both the highest tier of fashion and quality construction. That's like being known as the most insufferable and annoying person in a Carol Christian Pole Discord server. High skill floor, that's all I'm saying. Fashion is subjective, but the reason I say it's one of the best Japanese fashion brands is because it receives near universal praise. When every fashion enjoyer eventually makes their mandatory pilgrimage to Japan, it's required that they hit up all the different Kapital stores like Pokemon gyms. But anyway, one of the most iconic pieces from Kapital is also arguably one of the best pre-distressed clothing items available on the market, the Boro jacket. Although the brand has produced many different clothing pieces in this style, the jacket is generally the most sought after and recognizable piece. The term Boro comes from the onomatopoeic Japanese word boro boro, which refers to something ragged, worn out, or distressed. Boro specifically is a traditional Japanese textile that has been mended in a patchwork-like manner to extend its lifetime, and is usually achieved with sashiko-style stitching techniques. Historically, these textiles were utilized in rural areas of Japan and were handed down for generations to preserve every last scrap of precious cotton before industrialized fabric production became more commonplace in Japan. Nowadays, it takes an incredible amount of work and craftsmanship for Kapital to replicate this extremely aged, worn-in and intricate look. From what I've seen, they seem to be the only brands that have really mastered and honed in this authentic looking antique Boro style. I've seen a lot of DIY or small brand Boro jackets around the internet, and while still extremely impressive, they don't really hit the same as what Kapital have consistently produced. The Netherlands-based brand Bleeding Indigo dropped this military-style Boro jacket, which to me has a more contemporary look but is still so insane looking. While I feel Kapital is the gold standard for pre-distressed clothes, I really do think that over the past decade, distressing has become the go-to thing for trendy or more current brands to give their products a bit more edge and seem more elevated. It's like fashion's version of what slowed plus reverb versions of songs are for music. Part of this popularity of pre-distressed clothes is definitely due to the demand and rise of vintage clothes in recent times that have already got authentic tears, fades and aging, with brands attempting to offer an easier alternative in trying to go toe-to-toe with your local Depop resellers at thrift shops. But I feel like most of these pre-distressed clothes end up looking a bit unnatural and not that great. They usually look pretty good in product photos, but when you eventually get them in hand, the tears and fraying can often look quite methodical and the fades look sprayed on, which is usually how that look is achieved. This is likely not the case for absolutely every pre-distressed clothing item on the market, and I have experienced exceptions to this myself, but in general it does seem to be a bit hit or miss, with the usual outcome being an inauthentic look. It would be interesting to hear what experiences you guys have had with buying pre-distressed clothes, so yeah, leave a comment. As already mentioned, punk and grunge massively popularized distressed clothes, with grunge really pushing the authentic distressing, as musicians from that scene would often wear worn out clothes that were usually thrifted. Ever since then, vintage fashion has only become more and more in demand due to its accessibility among other benefits such as affordability and sustainability. Nowadays it's extremely popular, with it being the main reason why so many people can afford to be fashionable. If you want authentic distressed clothes with amazing fades, then naturally you'd think vintage and thrifting is the way to go, but unfortunately it has gotten so competitive, and that goes for all desirable vintage clothes. Going thrifting nowadays, in my experience, is just trawling through polyester riddled fashion from the 2000s, and then when you do find something good, it's priced a lot higher because all these shops are clued up on the value of things nowadays. Over the past few years, I've just sort of slowly given up on thrifting in person and will mainly buy secondhand clothes online. But maybe this is just a me issue, and I just don't have that dog in me anymore to really hunt for these more unique or valuable vintage finds at a steal price. I also think this might be less of an issue for people in the US because from what I've seen online, you lot have stuff like the Goodwill bins and just more and larger thrifting options, and in general I see Americans have way more success with thrifting on social media. Here in the UK, the only real options to get insane cheap finds are charity shops, but these are usually small and just get absolutely rinsed by Depop resellers. Especially living in London. Every time I pass a charity shop, I always see a micro-trend final boss in there with a big blue IKEA bag, clearly doing a big Depop reseller tour, clearing out all of the local shops, all to fund their Gales and horse tranquilizer addiction. In my experience, it's almost impossible to buy any nice, authentically distressed vintage clothes at a good price from UK charity or vintage shops, so if you really want those lovely faded true vintage items, then you just kind of have to suck it up and pay a higher price on online secondhand market or from more curated secondhand shops at a premium. I understand there's like a collector element to this scene too, with certain military clothes and workwear that have historical value being sought after by collectors, but that's not purely down to aesthetics and has got the whole Funko Pop factor to it as well. It is kind of ironic that the fashion hype culture that was popularized in the mid-2010s has become present in most genres of fashion nowadays. And even faded and thrash clothes are hype items, which at any other point in the past 50 years would have probably just been thrown away. I think for specifically men's fashion, thrashed and faded clothes are a way of making fairly minimal outfits a bit more interesting and unique, while also keeping a level of ruggedness that appeals to the male ego. We don't get as many clothing options as women, and society tends to shit on men for trying to dress in a way outside of the very small box of what is deemed acceptable. The final and sort of bonus category of distressed clothes are the ones specifically purchased new for the wearer to age in distress themselves. The most popular example would be raw denim, which is also usually selvedge, with the popular goal of purchasing these types of jeans being to fade them down into a unique look like this. Full grain leather products can also kinda be viewed in this way, although it's less that these products are designed for you to distress into a unique look like raw denim, and more that the materials tend to age nicely. Obviously, some people try to keep their full-grain leather products in pristine condition, but others will also seek to achieve a more worn-in look with a unique patina and stacking. Guidi footwear is a good example of this and usually already has quite a worn look due to the brand's object dyeing process, but the customer base tends to favour this stacked and worn-in look that you get from wearing these boots regularly. A lot of high fashion designers have also experimented with the idea of clothes made to be distressed. The most famous example is Margiela's cracked white paint motif, which is iconic at this point. The idea of this is to visibly show and emphasize the passage of time with an appreciation for ephemera. Another more specific example would be the hoodies and crewnecks from Raf Simons' 2002 Virginia Creeper collection. These were treated with an aggressive acid wash, which not only damaged the cotton but sped up the degrading process for the clothes. This meant that every wear and wash of the piece would cause it to disintegrate a lot faster than any normal hoodie or crewneck would. Virginia Creeper is one of Raf's most popular collections, so these clothes, which are now all very distressed and fucked up, go for a lot of money. Whenever distressed clothes get brought up in discussions outside of fashion-centric communities or spaces, the go-to layman response is always to point out either the absurdity of deliberately wearing damaged clothes or to say how it is distasteful and labeling it as glamorizing poverty. Whenever Margiela or Balenciaga comes out with anything comically overly distressed, the mainstream media is always so quick to sensationalize its insensitivity or out-of-touchness, and it almost feels like these publications are on payroll from these brands. All these so-called hit pieces do is give these brands the exposure and virality that these products were made specifically to achieve. Do you really think that Balenciaga's clientele give a shit? I mean, they're already spending thousands on stuff like this, so I'm sure they are pretty committed to the brand. This is essentially just rage bait as a viral marketing tactic, which everyone by now knows is a classic move from Demna. I'm not saying that appropriation of poorer and even homeless communities hasn't occurred in a distasteful way before. In fact, Balenciaga, along with a few other fashion labels, have been accused of copying this Ukrainian homeless man called Slavik without giving any form of credit or compensation. This is one of many cases where high fashion has appropriated the homeless community without any attempt to at least compensate or uplift the destitute people they reduce to an aesthetic. While I understand and agree that it is distasteful for designers to commodify homelessness and appropriate a horrible and degrading part of that extremely unfortunate lifestyle that no one chooses to be in, I also think this attitude often gets extended to fashion that is distressed to any extent, and I always think, is it not better that there's a market and demand for these sorts of clothes instead of them just ending up in landfill? Most of the time when I hear distressed clothes being discussed outside of fashion circles, it often gets reduced to the idea of rich people cosplaying as working class people. And while a lot of nuance is often left out, it is also undeniable that there is a level of privilege that comes with being able to wear distressed clothes for purely aesthetic purposes. Wealthier people are happy to wear worn out and fucked up clothes as they don't have money related stresses and insecurities. They are usually not worried about if someone thinks they are poorer due to their outfit because they know that their bank balance will say otherwise, whereas the situation is a bit different for working class people who in many cases do the opposite of this. For example, look at the fashion subculture of mod, where a key part of it was working class kids dressing in an aspirational way and wanting to look the part of the wealth that they wish to one day have. This sentiment of aspirational dressing carried over into the football's casual fashion movement, which famously resulted in hooligans, and then the high fashion brands associated with them became completely devalued by middle and upper class UK culture. Burberry treated their stereotypical association with what the UK upper class called chavs like a disease and spent years and tons of resources trying to rid themselves of it. You know, up until working class culture was trendy in the mid-2010s, and then they did that Gopnik, aka Russian chav inspired collection in collaboration with Gosha Rubchinsky. I do think there is a lot of nuance to the politics of wearing distressed clothes, and it is and will always be a bit of a grey area. However, wearing a faded t-shirt is not the same as pretending to be homeless. I believe making wearing damaged, aged, or distressed clothes of any kind only acceptable when it's done out of necessity pushes this idea that you are required to be constantly consuming new clothes to be in a morally sound position. This perpetuates rampant consumerism and only serves to benefit massive corporations who destroy the planet by churning out clothes and does nothing for people actually experiencing poverty. There is undeniably a beauty to old, aged, and imperfect things, and this is something that is not exclusive to fashion by any means. People are obsessed with the grain and imperfect look of film photography and will favour it over digital despite the cost and inconvenience of shooting on film. Over the past decade in graphic design, there's been an obsession with noisy and textured design despite it all being done on computer software, which can easily achieve pixel-perfect, clean-looking stuff. Even with growing plants, people are willing to buy ones that have been poached and ripped from their habitats because they are usually older, gnarlier, and more weathered looking, which is much harder to achieve in cultivation. In this squeaky clean, clinical world that is constantly getting pushed on us by every industry, it's clear that some people just want to embrace imperfection and uniqueness. So why are distressed clothes so popular? In my opinion, I think it comes down to texture, complexity, and character, which all add to a feeling of uniqueness, which is something that is highly coveted across fashion, so it shouldn't be surprising. It's nice having clothes that you know are completely unique, even if that uniqueness is a product of imperfections. That's the end of the video, goodbye.